So it's not just in evolution or pandemics or, we see this issue across the spectrum in the scientific community that science has become politicized, and they use the tools they have to basically exclude views that they don't like, that are not, polite for polite conversation to be allowed in.
And unfortunately, because we're dealing with human beings, because most scientists are actually human beings, we're dealing with power, we're dealing with money, we're dealing with greed. When you're speaking about a drug, when you're talking about careers, there is so much involved. And that's one of the reasons that I think that we have to be more skeptical of any establishment, including the scientific establishment, because you start realizing that they begin to circle the wagons. We got a good thing going. We don't want people to come in and to rock the boat. And we saw this so much with COVID, but in any event, it really is. I think we're at a paradigm shifting moment. Welcome to Socrates in the studio. I am sitting here in, I believe this is Seattle, with my guest, Casey Luskin.
Great to be here with you, Eric.
The idea that faith is at odds with science, and I know that that's, to put it mildly, very, very silly. Nonetheless, we live in a culture that drank that Kool-Aid, and it falls to such as we to help people understand that it is wrongheaded. You have edited this really monumental work, The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith, exploring the ultimate questions about life and the cosmos. What will people find in this book? Because it is, in fact, comprehensive.
Yeah, so as you said, Eric, it's an issue that many people wrestle with. And although we may think, it's easy to reconcile science and faith, this is an issue that people sincerely struggle with sometimes. So what we wanted to do in The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith is put together a volume that would answer people's toughest questions. How do we explain the origin of the universe? Did life come about naturally through unguided chemical processes? Is there evidence of fine-tuning of the laws of nature that make our universe look like it's specially suited for life? What about the origin of humans? Did we evolve from ape-like ancestors? We address those and many other questions in that book. Each chapter in that book is basically a hot-button question that people would want to have an answer to in the science-faith conversation. And each chapter is relatively short. We try to put sort of these comprehensive, meat-packed chapters that give you the data and the information you would want to help answer that question without having to read, like 100 pages or something like that. So it's a very, very concise yet comprehensive book.
I have to ask you another question. It is a little personal in the sense that I'm always curious how people find themselves where they are in life. I mean, here you are at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, dealing with this all the time, dealing with it extraordinarily well. But how did you find yourself at this place? Were you raised as a person of faith? Was science important to you growing up? How did these things come together?
No, I appreciate the question, Eric. I don't get to talk about this a whole lot. I was not really raised in what I would call a religious household. My mother is a Christian, and she did raise me going to church. But on my dad, on his side of the family, probably more of like an agnostic, secular Jewish kind of background. I was raised actually observing many of the Jewish holidays, so kind of raised in a sort of a hybrid Jewish-Christian household, but not really religious. I mean, we didn't pray before meals. We didn't talk about the Bible in my home. I love both my parents, have great relationships with both of them. It's my birthday today, so I've spoken to both of them on the phone
this
morning. So, I'm very close to my family, but it wasn't a religious household. And topics like science and faith were not really talked about a lot. For me, this was an issue that I started to wrestle with when I went to college. And I was taking all these courses in evolution.
Okay, now, where were you at college?
I was at University of California, San Diego.
Okay, when you were at college, did you have any kind of faith at that point?
Yes.
You did? And
I did.
How so?
I was raised going to church with my mom, and so I would have definitely called myself a Christian going into college. I was a Christian, and I was very involved with like InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. But at the same time, I was taking all these courses in evolution. UC San Diego was, and I think it still is, the #1 public university for biology research in the United States. So very, very science-focused school, very evolution-focused school. And I was getting hit with evolutionary, claims in almost all my classes.
It's interesting. Did you take the courses in evolution deliberately because you were trying to figure this out, or did you just stumble on it? I'm always curious how people, how they find their way into what they're doing.
Yeah, to be honest, it was deliberate, Eric. I was going to college. I wanted to explore the world. I wanted to figure out, what did I really believe? I was trying to seek truth. I was asking questions, and I want to know what those answers were. So my very first class I took, first day of my freshman year, 8:30 in the morning, I'd never gotten up that early in my whole life, was a course titled History of the Earth and Evolution. And I ran across the quad and got there probably, a couple minutes late because I couldn't get up that early, and learned about evolution. And that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to understand whether there was actually evidence for this claim that we just evolved through material unguided processes.
And at what point did you come to the belief, which I share, that in fact, what they're teaching ain't right? That they've got this theory, they've settled it in their minds, but as you look at it, you go, I don't think it's so settled.
So as I went through my freshman year, almost every elective opportunity, I would take a class in evolution. And as I learned more and more about evolution, I was realizing that my questions were not being answered. My experience was that the more evolution I took, the more skeptical I became. One of the biggest questions I had was, we see all these complex features in living organisms. How did they evolve one little mutational step at a time, according to Darwin's theory? So at the end of my freshman year, a buddy of mine recommended I read this book called Darwin's Black Box. You might have heard of it.
That's Michael
Behe.
Michael Behe at Lehigh University.
Yes, and the book had just come out.
I was just going to say, if I'm doing the math, figuring out how old you are, it must have just come out.
It
so
had come
he's
out
the
just
one.
a few months earlier.
This is where he puts forth this atom bomb of an idea of irreducible complexity. Explain that briefly, because that is. Once I understood that, I thought, wow, the Darwinians, they've got a real problem here. I mean, to this day, they haven't figured out what to do with it, except I think to sneer at it and to say it's not science. But when you read that book, first of all, how did you find that book? You really obviously were deeply interested in this at a very young age.
Well, I had all these friends. We were science majors, and we would talk about these things. How do you reconcile science and faith? How do you understand the Bible? Is evolution true? We had dorm conversations till 2 or 3 in the morning. And so one of my friends, who was a fellow science major at the end of my freshman year, said, Casey, you've got to read this book by this guy, Michael Behe, titled Darwin's Black Box. And he promotes this idea of intelligent design. I didn't know hardly anything about intelligent design at that point. I was very new to the issue. So I read that book during an internship my summer year after my freshman year of college. And this idea of irreducible complexity that Michael Behe put forth basically says that there are many features of nature which require a certain core set of parts to be present, or else they don't work. Okay, so for example, he describes this molecular machine called the bacterial flagellum. It's basically an outboard motor on the back of bacteria, spins around, helps them swim through a liquid medium to be able to find food.
Okay, this is the classic example, but when I first read about this, I said, this is unavoidably amazing that you have this flagellum, this tail, that rotates at high speed. I mean, what are we talking about? This is as tiny, you can't even imagine how tiny this is.
They're microscopic. They spin typically about 18,000 RPM, but they've been clocked at 100,000 RPM. And it's been said that they may have close to 100% energetic efficiency. So this dwarfs the efficiency and the capabilities of any machine designed by a human, but it looks like an outboard motor. It runs like a rotary engine that humans have built. And we've done experiments.
And so where do we find where do you find the flagellum? In other words, this is where?
They're found on bacteria, basically.
Okay, so
inside your gut.
In our own bodies,
yeah,
we have these bacteria with this mechanism
hopefully
described.
Not too many, or you might have a bad case of the stomach flu.
Okay.
But yeah, they are found in bacteria like E. coli that are found in our gut, and they basically help them swim around to find food. Many types of bacteria have flagella.
So Michael Behe, I interviewed him at a Socrates in the city, I don't know, 8 years ago at Lehigh or in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. But this became like the how do I put it? it was the one thing that you put it in front of scientists, or he would put it in front of scientists and say, excuse me, please explain how it's possible for something of this extraordinarily complexity to have evolved. The idea being that there's no way to get there incrementally. That's the key,
That's
right?
right. You can't build it one little step at a time because it requires a certain large core minimum set of parts to be present, or it doesn't even work. If you don't have all those necessary parts there, you don't get a functional flagellum. And then there's no reason for natural selection to preserve that feature. So it's a direct challenge to Darwin's theory, which says you have to build everything up one little step-by-step mutation at a time.
Okay, so I remember when this came out, and I was fascinated by it. I'd never heard of irreducible complexity. I didn't know Michael Behe. And I thought, wow, this is a conundrum for people who insist on incremental change over time. What do you do with this? And I remember we had Francis Collins at a Socrates in the City. I guess this was either 2008 or 2009. And he very flippantly, I thought, dismissed it, said, oh, that's been solved. Somebody has figured it out. But he didn't explain how it had been solved. And to this day, I'm wondering, are there people that somehow believe that they have solved this conundrum?
People have lots of beliefs that are false. So people do certainly claim that they have refuted irreducible complexity. But I can tell you, when you look through the technical literature, you will not find any stepwise evolutionary explanation for how the flagellum evolved. It is simply absent. It does not exist.
Okay, so that's one example of irreducible complexity, one that might maybe be easier for us to understand would be the human eye, or the eye, right? And so what's the idea there? That in order to get to an eye over time, that's essentially not possible? It's too complex?
It's the same concept. Can you build it up one step at a time? And in Darwin's black box, Behe looks specifically at the biochemistry that underlies vision. He's a biochemist, so he's looking at all these little molecules that are helping our eyes to process light. And he says, look, if you're missing one of these necessary molecules, then the system doesn't work. You have to have all the parts there and it works, or it's missing something and it doesn't work. You can't build it one little step at a time.
He also talks about a mousetrap as an example of irreducible complexity. Like when you have a mousetrap, how could you get there in steps? Either you have a mousetrap that works, or you don't. There's no like half of a mousetrap, and then we're going to improve on it. Well, I guess the other thing that I found compelling, the idea that if you're making the case that eyes evolved, you have to make the case that they evolved along the same lines in various. In other words, if I am not mistaken, that in other words, unless I evolved, down the line from, you could make the case that okay, it evolved in apes and then it found its way to us. But you'd also have to believe that since we're not descended from birds, you'd have to believe that the eye evolved independently in birds or in lizards or anything that is not something from which we have descended.
You're on to something, but let's just reframe it a little bit. So evolutionary biology would say that birds and lizards, we all share a common ancestor that had an eye. Okay, so there's not a problem there. But you're right.
So I'm wrong about that.
But you're right on the bigger point that according to evolutionary science, they actually claim that the eye had to have evolved independently many different times in different lineages. Let me give you a really striking example. The octopus, okay? If you look at the design of the octopus eye, it has a camera type eye that has a design that is very, very similar to the vertebrate eye, the eye that's found in us or lizards or birds. It's a very, very similar eye. But if you try to figure out what did the common ancestor of the octopus, mollusks, and vertebrates, what did that ancestor have? Did it even have an eye? We don't know. There's no reason to think that that common ancestor had an eye, much less a camera type eye with a very, very similar design. And not only is the sort of the larger structural design of the eye similar, even some of the biochemistry of these eyes is very, very similar. So we're looking at what evolutionary scientists call convergent evolution. It's basically similarity that cannot be explained by common ancestry. And when we see these extreme examples of quote unquote convergent evolution, I would say, and many scientists in our movement would say, that's better explained by common design than by sort of independent evolution or common ancestry. You can't explain it through some evolutionary mechanism. Common design based upon a common blueprint is a much more elegant way to explain that data.
Okay, so what is it that triggers people who seem to be wedded to the idea of blind Darwinian evolution? I mean, they seem to be infuriated by these questions, which are legitimate scientific questions. In fact, they're more than legitimate. They seem to be fundamental to settling what happened. Let's assume we don't know what happened, so we have some facts. So suddenly Michael Behe comes up with this novel, extraordinarily compelling idea, question, but folks, even people ostensibly Christians, the Biologos folks, Francis Collins and company, they seem somehow infuriated by the question. Why do you suppose that would be? I mean, I find it strange. I'm always curious.
It's a very complicated but important question you're asking. I think that for some folks, it's a lot of career concerns. People have invested their careers in the evolutionary paradigm, and to now, question that could lead to serious, jeopardy for their advancement in their careers. I've even seen evolutionary scientists like Lynn Margulis, who was a member of the National Academy of Sciences, an evolutionist, but she was a critic of Darwinism. And she said that as soon as she starts to question Darwinism, she becomes persona non grata in the room, because there's just sort of this, intolerance towards people criticizing the reigning paradigm of evolutionary biology, evolutionary theory, Darwinian theory. So there's a lot of pressures on scientists to sort of conform to that standard evolutionary view. And I think that's one thing. There's also, in this particular issue, there's also worldview considerations, right? Some people's worldviews, they rest on this idea that we evolved through strictly unguided evolutionary processes. It's very core to their being, who they are, what they believe about the universe, sort of their lack of belief in
So they're not even open to the idea that that's wrong. They're not even open to that idea, which strikes me as fundamentally unscientific. But I guess they've moved so far past questioning it that they can't be bothered to go back and check.
I mean, I think that these folks do believe in evolution in good faith. I'm not saying here that, they know that it's wrong and somehow they still believe it's true. They believe it in good faith, but there's a lot more than just, pure rational scientific issues going on here. There's career considerations, there's worldview considerations, and it's not just about the evidence. Yeah.
Yeah, but if it's not about the evidence, just about the evidence, then it's not about the science. That's. I always have to say, as a non-scientist, when I discover scientists not behaving scientifically in their thinking, it bothers me. It strikes me as unavoidably hypocritical and just troubling. It undermines science, generally speaking, because it makes me wonder what else are they not interested in looking at. And so this is a kind of a classic case, but I thought I'd bring it up. In the interest of time, I want to talk to you about the other book we have here. By the way, this is magnificent, the Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith. I look forward to reading the essays. There's just so much in here. And actually, before I move on, what led you to put this together? Because this is absolutely magnificent. And the fact that the title says The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith, it really is comprehensive. So whose idea was it that we're going to find the best essay on X, the best essay on Y, because so much has been written on the subjects in this book, such a big subject. But who framed this originally?
Yeah, well, it was a collaboration with me and my co-editors, William Dembski and Joseph Holden. And we wanted to put together a resource for people to deal with many different topics where they could get answers to questions that were both concise and comprehensive. And so every chapter in that book is only, usually they're less than 10 pages long. You want to learn about, where did the universe come from? Or is there evidence for human-ape common ancestry? You can get it all in just a few pages and you'll still get the technical details. And so that we want to put together a resource that would just help people get the answers quickly. But I want to add on to what you just said, Eric, about, whether or not scientists are perfectly objective. This is a really important point that you raise. There's sort of the myth out there that scientists are like perfectly objective robots. But we need to understand that scientists are human beings. They're just like us. They're often doing what they're doing in good faith, but they make mistakes. And if anything has taught us this over the last few years. It's our experience with COVID, where we saw scientists with diametrically opposed opinions about, what treatments you should take, or what is the origin of this virus, or how should we address this through public health issues. We saw all these different opinions, and I believe that folks were generally, not necessarily always, but generally acting in good faith, but scientists can come to very different conclusions based upon the same data set. So it's not the case that the data, science just speaks with a monolithic voice, and that the data is just this thing that you interpret. It always comes out the same. Science can be very difficult to reason with sometimes, and people come to different conclusions. So I think on this issue of origins, you get the worldview implications in there, you get the career pressures, and it becomes a very different thing than just pure objectivity a lot of the time.
Well, before we get into origins per se, I think the reason that I am, not feigning shock, but am actually shocked when I hear about this kind of thing, I think it's so ironic because science in recent decades, recent centuries really, has set itself up as really this noble pursuit of truth, and has set itself up in contrast to the way it portrayed the church and the Aristotelians who crushed Galileo, who was trying to do science. But the irony, of course, is that it is now those in the scientific establishment who are behaving precisely like the worst caricatures of those in the church establishment who crushed Galileo, because Galileo was challenging a paradigm that was deeply established. And so now we have a deeply established paradigm that the scientific establishment has embraced, and they're doing precisely what they accuse the enemies of science in the story of Galileo of doing. So that irony is just extraordinary to me.
You're 100% right. With the politicization of science has become a topic that has been commented on by so many people over the last couple decades, and they're saying that it's only getting worse. Let's give an example that I read this morning, okay? This morning I opened the news, and the Supreme Court is going to be hearing a lawsuit over abortion pills and whether or not, it's okay to ban them, and the extent to which there's evidence that they may actually cause, health problems for women who take these pills. And lo and behold, one of the main papers that's been a study that was done that found that abortion pills have caused many health problems for women, that paper has just been retracted by one of the scientific journals that published this paper, okay?
Not by the author, but by the journal.
No, by the journal. In fact, the author of the paper, and I don't know anything about who the authors are, where they stand ideologically, but the author was quoted in a news story this morning saying, the timing of this is really suspicious. I think that there are ideological concerns going on here, and it's more than just about the science. So it's not just in evolution or pandemics, or, we see this issue across the spectrum in the scientific community, that science has become politicized, and they use the tools they have to basically exclude views that they don't like, that are not, polite for polite conversation to be allowed in.
And unfortunately, because we're dealing with human beings, because most scientists are actually human beings, we're dealing with power, we're dealing with money, we're dealing with greed. When you're speaking about a drug, when you're talking about careers, there is so much involved. And that's one of the reasons that I think that we have to be more skeptical of any establishment, including the scientific establishment, because you start realizing that they begin to circle the wagons. We got a good thing going. We don't want people to come in and to rock the boat. And we saw this so much with COVID, but in any event, it really is. I think we're at a paradigm shifting moment with the rise of the ID movement and so many other things. Even in my own book, Is Atheism Dead? I deal with a lot of this, and I think we're at a, maybe even a tipping point, that there's something going on that in the decades ahead, a lot of these givens will be upended that we've been forced to deal with.
The public is becoming aware of this. And look, I'm a scientist, all right? I know lots of scientists. They're great people. But at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We're all fallible. We're all capable of making mistakes. You talk to 100 scientists, you will get 100 stories of reviewers who didn't treat them fairly, or a paper that was wrongly rejected, or not being invited to a conference over some political issue. You'll hear stories like this all the time.
Yeah.
It's just a reality of the world we live in. And the important thing, I think, is for the public to appreciate
Yeah.
that science is not always perfectly objective.
Yeah, because scientists are human beings, and human beings are flawed and self-centered.
I'm one of them. I mean,
yeah,
can't-
I'm two of them. Okay, let's leap to the thing that I wanted to get to. Human beings, we just mentioned. We're all human beings. Scientists